visible?
Yes, sir.
Great. So let's start with our session, shadowed reality and what GDP doesn't tell. Now, I was looking for some of your college pictures. This is what I found. I hope it's a correct picture because there were multiple Maulana Azad colleges. I've never been to your institution, so this is what I could basically a decent picture that I got. So let's start with Joseph Stiglitz. So Stiglitz has talked about this, that GDP basically measures everything, but except for what really matters. And this is what our intention is, to see that what essentially is that GDP not capturing. Because when we're talking about the top line figure, as was one of the in the introduction, it was mentioned that the top line figure of India's GDP is 7.2%. It is the fastest growing major economy in the world, and at least in the G20 countries, it's one of the fastest growing countries. And then apart from that, we hear about India's story on LinkedIn as well, where you have third largest number of unicorns that are coming up, and then you have so many investors lining up towards India. But there are other elements which are deeper in the layer, which kind of suggests that not all is well. I mean, apart from the top line, and that is what we are going to discuss. But at the same point of time, if all is not well, then what? How is this government being elected? And in all likelihood, you will see the government re-elected in 2024. Then there's something that the government is doing really well, and we'll talk about that as well. So let's start our session now. To start our session, I typically use a kind of an analogy from one of my favorite sports, which is a F1. Now, what we are going to do is, in the first part of our lecture, we are going to start with the vitals of an economy. That I'll first tell you what is, how do you actually analyze growth, what is the demand side of the growth, what is the supply side of the growth. So basics that econ 101 that people at times need to be aware of. So we'll discuss that. Then we'll move on to the trends of GDP, that why is India's GDP one of the fastest growing? I mean GDP in the world. What are the factors towards that top line growth? So you need to also understand critically that what aids growth in India and what does not aid growth, and why is it so susceptible. So we'll talk about the consumption engine of India's growth and the investment engine of India's growth. So these two engines will be talking about. Then we will be also be talking about the challenges in growth, what GDP doesn't tell, and what are the other parameters that you need to check to see whether the economy is really healthy or not. And then finally, we'll also talk about inclusive growth, that why India has not achieved it and what needs to be done. We are right now at the midpoint of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Where are we as a world? Where are we as a country? Where are we standing in those terms? In fact, this is also the time of GST. This is global stock taking of the Paris Agreement. So where are we with respect to that global stock taking procedure? Then finally, I'm going to talk about what makes India tick, and then why is this government so popular if it's not been able to deliver on terms of inclusive growth. But if you see the numbers in both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, especially Lok Sabha, it's a very popular government. Then what is making it take? We need to understand the political economy of this particular governance model as well. And finally, we'll come down to some Q and A's. Whatever questions that you might have, I'll be happy to take them on. So let's start with our session now. Before starting my session, I want some interaction with you folks. That I mean, most of you would have had this experience of COVID. I myself had three experiences with COVID. So just like an iOS update, my antibody update wanted whenever a new variant of COVID was coming. So my antibodies were said that we need to update ourselves, and I used to get the new version of the newer version of this I used to get. So so when you check the vitals for COVID, what do you actually measure? So if I ask you that you need to measure someone's this thing COVID, I mean a COVID patient management, what will you measure? How will you manage a patient? Come on, folks, write it on the chat box. Most of you would have experienced COVID. So what would you have checked if in a COVID patient? Come on, folks, let's make this interactive. Let's not make this one-sided discussion. Any oxygen level is one. Yes, absolutely. Oxygen level is one. Another O2 level. Yes, there are other parameters also. What do you how do you check someone's whether that's a serious uh, sense of taste and fever? Yes, of course. Something else? Okay, let me reveal this now. You have something called as CT value, which talked about how deep the infection is. You talked about the SpO2, the pulse rate. You also talked about temperature, and these are the basic patient management vitals that you used to you see to manage a particular patient. Then what are the vitals for an economy? For an economy, the vitals are GDP and GVA, and we'll see that these are. Just a second, folks. Sorry, folks. So GDP and GVA is one. Then you have high frequency indicators. Again, then that could also tell you that how the economy is doing. I will talk about a number of high frequency indicators like IIP. You have PMI. You have PMI services. You have GST collections. So you have these high frequency indicators which tell you that how the economy is doing. Because of the fact that, see, GDP GVA comes with a lag, so it comes with a 2 month lag. So you might be aware that the economy parameters are seen in quarters. So you have Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. Now whenever a quarter is over, after 2 months of the quarter is over, this data is released, and by that time it's too dated. And therefore you really can't decide. You can't really use the GDP GVA data to make real time policy adjustments. And that's why you use these high frequency indicators like IIP, like PMI, like you have CMI's data, you have GST data, so tax collection data. So you have these high frequency inflation data. You have these high frequency indicators on the basis of which you can then adjust your economy. Then you have employment figures, which again tells you about the vitals of the economy. uh, Poverty, inequality, health, education, inflation, these are other parameters that tells you about the health. And we are going to discuss about the non obvious health parameters, which tell you about whether the growth pattern is inclusive or not. Then let's talk about econ 101. Now in econ 101, we already know that how the growth pattern is. This is something that you should be aware of, is that how the growth just a second, folks. Is my slide visible, folks? The saving investment ICOR slide, because I can see something else on my screen.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So the saving investment ICOR growth. So this is how a typical growth. This is how a typical growth model is. Now you have savers in an economy, which gives rise to what is called as gross domestic savings. So you have households, corporates, and governments, which basically save. And among these, it's the households who save the maximum amount. Uh, the saving investment ICOR growth. So there must be a slide that is going
So
on.
the home page is
So the
visible.
yes, sir.
Okay. I think that is the problem. Just give me a second. Yeah, I think now it should be okay. Yes. Sorry.
Yes, sir. Visible.
Yeah. So I was actually the other two slides. Let me just go through the other two slides quickly. This is what I was talking about. Mhm. Yeah. So I was talking about these high frequency indicators, and then econ 101. So when we discuss about the saving investment and ICOR growth pattern, so what happens is that in an economy you have these savers. Household is the biggest. I mean among these three, household is the biggest saver, and these savings are channelized by financial intermediaries like banks, NBFCs, financial institutions, just like LIC and other non-banking financial institutions are there. And then people and investors and borrowers borrow from these institutions, and these are households, corporates, and government. Among these, the corporations are the biggest chunk of borrowers, and that sum of all the investment that is done is called as gross capital formation, and that goes into what is called as and it gets converted into GDP through a concept called as ICOR, incremental capital output ratio. Now think of it, and these are very important terms, because if you want to understand India's growth pattern and why is it growing, why is it not growing, you need to understand GDS, GCF, and ICOR. So think about for a very generic thing, for a very generic student, think of it that just one day before the exam, what happens? One day before the exam, you were able to study the entire semester in 3 hours, which means for every 1 hour, your ability to, or your capacity to understand is, or to read, is much more higher. That means your ICOR, your incremental capital output ratio, for every 1 hour you are able to absorb a lot of material. Similarly, this ratio talks about that if you are if there is one unit, if you want to increase the GDP in the country by 1%, the denominator says that if you want to increase the GDP by 1%, how much capital is needed. Now, if this ratio is less, if ICOR is less, that means efficiency of capital. That means you are able to, for example, if you have to read 100 pages, you're able to read them in 1 hour just before the exam. And if I give it to you right now, you will probably take 24 hours or maybe 48 hours to read those 100 pages. That means right now your own ICOR is very low, and when your exams near, your ICOR starts decreasing, which essentially says that you are become very much more efficient. And that is what our intention is, to make ourselves much more efficient, but that can only happen in long run in a country. Now, that leads to ultimately a ratio which is change in GDP upon change in investment. So what a country tries to aim is that we want higher portion. This is what we want higher GCF, because the more that your GCF is, the more you will be able to convert that investment into GDP. Now, right now, our ICOR is 4. Now, when we say our ICOR is 4, that means for each unit of output. So if you want to increase your GDP by 1%, you need 4% increase in investment. And that is why our aim is to increase our investment rate in the country. If our investment rate is 32%, divided by 4, it will lead to a growth rate of 8%. And that is why a lot of focus is on increasing investment in the country. And that is why you see competition between states these days. You see very recently, the government of UP had come up with this trade fair, and then this investment summit. Individual states, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, all these different states are competing with each other for investments, because investments is something that will lead to a higher nominal number of the GDP. So this is why you will see this mad rush in the country for investments, for FDI, even at the subnational level, even states fighting for different kinds of investment from corporate sector. Then how do you measure, when we say measuring the GVA? So there are two sides to the story. Where you when you'll see the GDP numbers or the GVA numbers, you need to identify that there's something called as GVA, which is different from what is called as GDP. So GVA is basically the supply side of the economy. When we talk about the supply side of the economy, you have the agrarian sector, the agricultural sector, you have the industrial sector, and the services sector, because this is where the growth will come from. This is where the value addition will come from in the economy. Who are the producers is what we are trying to question here. And when we talk about that, what we see, and this pattern of India's growth is also very particular to India. What we see is that India's GVA comes heavily from the services sector. 55% is coming from the services sector, which again will have implications on the growth model that we have. It is said that we have a service-led economy, and that was not historically true. Now, I want you to focus on the next slide. Now this again tells you the kind of problem that we are in, and all of that I am discussing right now is going to give you a kind of a background into why Indian model of development is not very sustainable right now. Now if you see what is there on the x-axis, on x-axis I have timeline, basically years changing. On y-axis what I have is share in GVA. So if you can see, right, I mean, at the time of early 60s, the share of agricultural sector was around 51% of the total GVA. So if you're producing 100 rupees of value of goods and services in the country, 51 rupees was being contributed by the agrarian sector. The services sector was contributing 26 rupees and the industrial sector was contributing 22 rupees. Now let me turn this into a slide and let's see, just carefully see what happens. Just try to observe what is happening here. Now see what has happened in late 80s. The share of the agrarian sector is continuously going down and the share of the services sector is continuously increasing. They're absolutely mirror images of each other, whereas the industrial sector, if you can see, it's just minutely climbing its share. But this is it's a very important benchmark in Indian political economy, where you have in late 1980s the services sector taking over the agrarian sector as the leading sector for the economy. Now let's continue with this. Oh, it's just I'll let it run through and then we will talk about it. Now see, this is what the problem in the Indian economy is, that what has happened is you have a huge decline in the agrarian sector right now. The agrarian sector, depending on various numbers that you take, it's somewhere contributing to 15 to 18% of India's GVA, whereas the services sector is contributing around 53%. If you add, by the way, if you add construction to the services sector, it's around 60 to 63%. So if you see, what has happened is that you have this mirror images where the agrarian sector has seen a secular fall and the services sector has seen a secular increase, whereas you have a stagnation of the industrial sector. In fact, within the industrial sector, if I talk about the manufacturing sector has completely stagnated after 1990s. The share of manufacturing sector as India's GVA was somewhere around 15-16% in 1990, and right now also it's around 16%. Now that tells you a story that India's industrial sector has kind of stagnated, whereas the services sector has taken over and the agricultural sectors has gone down. Now this is in very contrast to what the workforce is. If you talk about the workforce, and we are going to talk about it, if you see the agrarian sector, around 45 to 46% of India's workforce is in the agrarian sector. So majority of people are coming together, working in the agrarian sector, and just contributing 15%. And that will show you a lot of distress in the agrarian sector, that a lot of people are working there but they're not contributing much to the economy, and that's why you will see such high amount of say inequality. You will also see such amount of distress in the agrarian sector, because you have too many people contributing too less to the economy. In terms of industrial sector, we'll talk about the fact that why industrial sector has not taken up. And in terms of services sector, what has happened is that only 28% of our workforce is there in the services sector. But because this is capital intensive, this is skill intensive, the kind of value addition that they are producing is much more, and that is why we see that the top line, and we'll talk about this, the top line of India's GDP is actually being pushed by the services sector and not by the majority of the section. So think of it as a class, like just like your class or your college. Think of it as you have 10 to 15 students in the college who have a really high GPA, and because they have a really high GPA, they're pushing the entire average to a higher notch. They all of them have 10 GPA or 9.5, 9.6 GPA. The entire average for the class is increasing. But if you go deep down, you will see that majority of the class is not really doing well, and you have a very top heavy kind of a performance. So this is also the case with India's economy. Once you dissect this growth, you will see where the problem lies. Then since we were talking about this growth rate, let's talk about the growth rate in terms of numbers. So if you see the total GDP growth rate, you can see that there is a dip in 2020-21. Then you have an increase, and then you can see that there is an increase in the recent few quarters. This is quarter and quarter growth rate of India's in the last few years, in the last 3 to 4 years. Then if you see the agrarian, the orange line is the agricultural sector. If you see, the agricultural sector is one sector which helped us keep afloat, especially during the times of COVID. And this is the V-shaped recovery during COVID. And if you see that, it is the agrarian sector which kept us afloat. But of late, you've seen a decline here. And then if you see the industrial sector, you can see the volatility that the industrial sector has had over the last few years, especially because of the labor problems that they have had during COVID. And then you have superimposed on it, you have the services sector. But what is more interesting is the last part, is the last 2 3 quarters. If you see what we are seeing in the last few quarters is that same old divergence that we used to have here. See, all across all this pre-COVID era, you had this growth phenomena where the services sector used to grow the highest, and the agricultural sector used to be at the lowest level. Can you see the same thing that is now being mimicked? That you have the services sector which is now picked up because the COVID lockdowns are over. The services sector is again booming, and again it's an elitist concept of the services sector. It's more of a consumption driven economy that you're talking about. So the services sector is really doing well. The industrial the total GDP is being buoyed because of the fact that the services contribute around 64 to 65% of your GDP. Whereas if you see the trend of the industrial sector and that of the agricultural sector, they are going down. Now, so this was the analysis that I've had, was from the side of GVA. That tells you one side of the picture. The other side, let me talk about the demand side of the economy, which is called as the GDP, the gross domestic product. Now we'll talk about it, but before that, I want you to work on certain math aspect as well, because this is something that I've found that students of economics are not very well aware of. Now, there is something called as GDP at constant prices, and there's something called as current prices. One thing that you should note is that when you're talking about the constant prices, what you do is you're something called as a base year. Now, this base year is for India is 2011 2012. So you multiply the prices of 2011 2012 with the quantity produced in a particular year, which leads to the constant GDP growth rate. So this is the constant prices growth rate that you get. And right now, if you talk about 2021-22, the amount of GDP that we have produced is 147 trillion rupees. You can also talk in terms of, you will when you read the budget. Why have I written these numbers is because when you read budget numbers, you'll often get confused. Why? Because these numbers are not given in trillions. These numbers will be given in lakh crores. So 147 trillion rupees is nothing but is 147 lakh crores. Now, what is a lakh crore? So if you do a little bit of maths, what you have is a lakh is 5 zeros, and a crore has 7 zeros. So if you multiply them, it is nothing but, if I say something is 1 lakh crore, it is nothing but 10 to the power of 12. And I can say 10 to the power of 12 is a trillion. So typically when I start with budget, and when I start with economic numbers, I tell students to convert everything that you have in terms of trillions. So India's GDP in constant terms is 147 trillion. In terms of current prices, what you do is you multiply it with the current prices. So the prices of 2021-22 into the quantity produced in 2021-22. And if you talk about 22-23, as someone rightly said, that the growth rate was 7.2%. So 7.2% on this number would be somewhere around 280 trillion rupees. So which is around 200 which is again somewhere around 3.5 trillion dollars. So if you see, these are the numbers that you should be very well aware of. And if you want to find the GDP deflator, all you need to do is current prices upon constant prices, you will find the GDP deflator. So these are certain things that you should be aware of when you read the numbers, because reading numbers, only after reading numbers you will be able to understand that what is behind these numbers. Then let us move to the other aspect, which is the quarterly growth rate, and this will tell you another problem in case of India, why India's growth rate is not very sustainable. So if you see this top line number, if you see this number now, what has happened is that this growth rate that we had was falling even before the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, so the pandemic stuck at in the last quarter of 2020, and the first quarter of 2021. So if you see this, even before the pandemic our GDP was falling down. And the GDP, and then the what the COVID did was, the COVID had reduced our basically ability to produce goods and services, and it reduced to the fact that our quarterly growth rate had gone down to minus 20, almost 25%. And then you have this amazing recovery which we call as the base effect, and that is why we call this as a V-shaped recovery. And then again a decline, and then you see again an increase. But in the other sense, what I want to tell you is that if you look at these numbers under the lens, this GDP number is fueled by one factor, which is the consumption engine. Now, typically, any particular economy, you have these three engines which are working. You have something called as the consumption engine. Now, when I say consumption, consumption basically means the consumption of the government and consumption of the private sector. So government consumes around, if you're producing 100 rupees of goods and services, the private sector will consume 60 rupees of that, and the government will consume around 10 rupees of that. And the investment is is somewhere around 30%, and your net exports is just around 1%, plus minus 1%. So if you talk about these three engines, among these three engines, what we see is that in India's case, our engine is completely fueled by the consumption engine. So and what we are seeing is that this consumption engine of late has been slowing down. So think of it in aerodynamic terms. Think of it as a airplane. Airplane has two major sides of engine, and what we are our kind of airplane is doing is that 70% of the thrust that we are getting into our airplane is from one particular engine, and that particular engine has started to stall down. That engine is started to slow down, and investment right now is not picking up so much. And with respect to net exports, we already know that the world is going through a phase of what is called as deglobalization. So therefore, we will not be having we are not hopeful for much options in terms of external growth rate. And that is where the biggest chink in our growth pattern is, that we have overly relied on the consumption engine. And we will talk about how this consumption engine is slowing down, and how we need to work more on our investment engine, and maybe tweak a little bit more on our net exports engine as well. Then let's now talk about, just a second. Let's talk about the other side of the story. What are the challenges ahead? What this headline number does not tell you. We are going to talk about briefly about different kinds of numbers which are masked by this top line number of 7.2%. Let's get into inequality first. That how has been the trend of inequality in the country. Now, if you see this number, now just see this trend line, these three trend lines that are there. What is this blue trend line telling you, or what is this yellow trend line telling you? Now, first, before that, see this benchmark year that I've created, which is for 1991. Now, after 1991, can you see that the top 1%, the income share of top 10% in the Indian economy, has continuously been increasing after 1991? See the case of top 1%. Top 1%, the share of income in the last after 1991 has continuously been increasing. And see the case of the bottom 50%. The share of the bottom 50%, which is the poorest lot, has started to go down. Now, all of them have of late stabilized, but what this shows is the kind of inequality that exists in our country. Now, there's a paper written by Thomas Piketty. He has a wonderful book called Capitalism. I would urge you to read that book. He's a Nobel laureate, by the way, and he's written this paper as well. India from British Raj to Billionaire Raj. Now, this paper talks about that the top 1% of India during the British Raj in 1922. In 1922, the richest 1% held around 21-22% of the country's national income. And when we talk about 2017 2018 data, it has reached the same level. In fact, it has breached that level. The top 1% actually hold around 24% of India's income resources. So which shows that what is very problematic in case of India. And a much more worrying aspect of this is that the government also knows about this. Now, I'll tell you a story about this. Is that in 2017, the government, there's this organization called as NSSO, National Statistical Survey Organization. Now, this organization comes up with various surveys. One of the surveys that it conducts is called as the Consumption Expenditure Survey. Now, this consumption expenditure survey becomes the basis of economists, like budding economists like you, economists like me, researchers like people that are there in departments. They work on this consumption expenditure survey to work on the poverty figures, inequality figures, and other aspects. Now in 2017, the government did this survey, and it immediately retracted this survey before it was leaked. It was leaked by a business newspaper called Business Standard, and from the leaked data, it was very evident that for the first time in many decades, the expenditure share of the bottom 40% has started to go down, which kind of gives you an indication that maybe the inequality in any ways is increasing. Maybe the poverty has also started to increase in the country. And that makes the argument of redistribution even stronger. And that's why you see the political economy of reservation these days. Why is every community harping on reservation, that every the communities which are in OBC want an SC or an ST status? Even communities in the OBCs want that we want a higher share. If you've read about the Rohini Commission report, the government is also thinking of subcategorization in the SCs, that there are certain SCs who do not get their due share in reservation. So why is this political economy of reservation there? It's because of the fact that the expenditure data shows that not everyone has been taken care of, despite this positive affirmation that you have done in through Article 14 and Article 15 and Article 16. So this is one thing. I've also provided a link of Professor Himanshu from JNU, who's written an article whose data I've used here for inequality. But another thing that you can use, I told you that we'll get into certain high frequency indicators. Now, one of the items that lower middle class people buy is two wheelers and four wheelers. The passenger cars is basically upper middle class, and the lower middle class basically buys two wheelers. Now, if you see the data for two wheelers, you can see that and these are basically the number of two wheelers that have been bought. And if you see the number of two wheelers that has been bought month by month is approximately 1.5 million two wheelers. And if you see this number, even in 2010, it was approximately the same. Now, ideally, you would expect that when the economy is increasing, when in the this is what we say in economics, that you increase the size of the pie, and then something will trickle down to the bottommost quarter of the pyramid. But that is not true. If that was true, that the number of scooters that was bought by the lower middle class would have increased, and that is still at around 1.5 million per month. And that was the same in case of 2010, and it's the same around even in 2023. So because of scale, I can't show you that June 2023 figures as well. So this again shows you that the consumption pattern has not really changed. And that's the same case in case of passenger cars also show you a similar, in fact a worrying figure, that the number of the number of four wheelers was the monthly figure was around a quarter of a million. in 2016. In fact, it was the same thing in case of 2010. It was a quarter of million, and now it has in fact gone down. Which again shows that the middle class and the lower middle class is clearly not doing well in the economy, and this will again in future not lead to sustainable growth, because these are the very people which will, if they're not able to afford basic things, then they'll come out on street, and then they'll protest for a number of reservations and number of other things. So this is one thing that the GDP doesn't tell us. Then let's talk about another factor. Let's talk about poverty. How has poverty been? Now, you might have seen the Niti Aayog has come up with these poverty figures. Uh, just a second, folks. Why is this slide not working? Okay. Now Niti Aayog has come up with this poverty indicator called. Just a second, folks. I think my PowerPoint just crashed. Just a second. Yes. So the PowerPoints are a little heavy, folks, on animations, I guess. So that's why they keep crashing at times. So so if you talk about poverty, now Niti Aayog had come up with this number very recently, that in India the poverty rate, according to the multidimensional poverty index, was around 25% in 2015-16, and it has come down to around 15% in 2019-21 now, which shows a 10 percentage point decrease in poverty. But this is in contrast to a number of other figures. Now, an economist by the name of Santosh Mehrotra from JNU had worked on the PLFS data, and based on that, he had extrapolated the numbers using the Tendulkar report. Now, remember, I told you that the consumption expenditure survey of 2017 was scrapped, and the only available numbers that we have for poverty, the poverty numbers that we have, are the 2011-12 Tendulkar report. Now that report talked about the fact that in India in 2004-2005 there were around 37%. This number, this is called as the headline poverty number. So the headline poverty count figure ratio was 37%, and it had reduced to 22% in 2011-12 according to the Tendulkar report. There's a methodology that Professor Tendulkar had adopted, based on which there was a 15 percentage point drop in poverty. But if you work the same numbers with the PLFS data, what Professor Malhotra says is that the poverty has increased in 2019-20, and remember, this is pre-COVID, folks, and the number of poor have increased from 270 million to 350 million. And this again shows us that maybe the poverty, the way that you calculate through the Tendulkar report, has increased. And what the multidimensional poverty index shows is that they've taken a broad look of poverty. Yes, I, to a certain extent, I do agree that we need a broader look towards poverty, but based on those numbers, we have seen a reduction in poverty. Now, if you talk about COVID, then this is from the World Bank, and this talks about the fact that in India and world, around 70 million people have been added to the poverty line just because of COVID, and of course majority of them will be in India. So that again shows that we need a much updated data set with respect to our consumption data, to really understand that what is the poverty level in the country, to see whether the growth at the top line is really percolating down to the lowest quarter of the pyramid or not. And that is why we need good statistics to be there, to be collected, and to be given to economists. Then let's talk about the other aspect of our growth, which is gender equality. Now, in terms of gender equality, we see that our country really is one of the poorest in terms of gender equality report. This is a gender equality report by you have the World Economic Forum, which comes up with the global gender gap report. and it says that India's gender gap, and it ranks India as 135. Now here you need to understand a couple of things, that it is majorly because of the lack of economic participation and opportunity that India has a very poor score. Now, why is that in India the economic participation and opportunities is so less, and how it can be seen is through India's workforce. Now, let me tell you another number now. Now, in economics, we work with when we talk about employment, we work with a number called as labor force participation rate. Now, what is this labor force participation rate? The labor force participation rate is basically people in the age group of 15 to 59. So this age group, people in the working age group who are either working or who are willing to work and who are actively looking for work. So carefully note it down. It is between the age group of 15 to 59, people who are working and people who are willing to work, and the caveat is actively looking for work. In this case, India's female labor force participation rate is somewhere around 23-24%. Now, what does this figure tell you? This figure tells you that in the age group of 15 to 59, out of 100 women that are there in the country, only around 23-24 women are either employed or are willing to work. And that is a stark, and by the way, this labor force participation rate, female labor force participation rate, is almost equivalent to that of Saudi Arabia, a theocratic state run by Sharia law, oppressing the women's right. And in a democracy, if we see, we have a female labor participation rate equivalent to that of Saudi Arabia. That tells you a story, that the kind of society that we are living in, the kind of patriarchal society that we are living in. And out of the total jobs that we have, only 10% over there, the women workforce participation rate was just 10%. And that is where India's growth model is not sustainable. You can't compare with China. We often try to compare ourselves with China, and we really are not in even the same stratosphere, because of the fact that Chinese labor force participation rate, especially the female labor force participation rate, is in the upper 60s. You basically think of it like trying to play a cricket match, that you have tied your one hand behind your back and you're trying to play Shoaib Akhtar. This is what you are absolutely doing. That half of your workforce, you're not even half of your potential workforce, you're not allowing them to work, and then you're thinking that you can compete with China. You can't really do that. So this is where India's problem lies. And even during COVID, the during the first wave, the huge impact, the majority impact was there on women. That is also the case of women's health, access to health and nutrition. Their access to health and nutrition is quite poor. Their access to education is extremely poor. You see the number of women who have ever used internet is just 33%. You see number of women who are literate with more than 10 years of education is just 40% in our country. And this shows that these are problems that we need to address if we want to address the bottom line of our GDP growth rate as well. Then coming to employment. In terms of employment, where is the problem? This is data from CMI. CMI is a private organization which gives you weekly and monthly data for employment rates. And see the employment rate. The employment rate is people of the total people that you have in the age group of 15 to 59, of the entire possible people who are in the working age group. How many people are actually working? If you see, from March 2016, it was around 40% or 42-43%. This has shown a secular decline. Even after COVID, you see a decline here, and this goes on to decline even currently. So this shows that employment issue is a major issue in case of our country. And that is why if you see, you might have seen in your own state that the government has come up with these permanent appointments. Even in teaching these days, the government has gone into employment mode, because it knows that it has not been able to fulfill the promises of employment in the last few years. But despite that, you'll see this government is extremely popular, and we'll talk about why, despite not being able to create employment, how is it being able to win the electorate? So the dehyphenization of economic performance versus political performance is a huge art that probably BJP has to tell, or has to show the rest of the world. So this is one thing. Then let's talk about education. Even in terms of education, this is a survey by one of my professors, Professor Jean Drees. Now this is a survey called a school survey. Now the school survey that was there basically talked about that how many students have not been able to go to school during COVID time. And there is a huge disproportionate burden on in the rural areas. During these surveys, what we found out was in rural areas only 8% of students were regularly online, studying online, and students who were not studying at all was 37%. Now this has to so we have an entire generation of 3 years which has not studied in school. And more than that, what is more important is the outcomes, the learning outcomes. There is a very important NGO which comes from West Bengal called as Pratham, and it comes up with this report called as ASAR report, Annual Survey of Education report. It's not just the hardcore numbers of money that you spent in education. It's also about the learning outcomes, and the learning outcomes are also extremely poor, which shows that if you're not even able to educate people, if you're not able to educate students well, then how will we shift them from the agrarian sector to the industrial sector? Remember that conundrum that we had in the initial portion that we talked about, that India has moved from being an agrarian economy to a service-led economy, and skipped the industrialization and the manufacturing phase. It's because of the fact that we don't have a sufficient amount of base of people who are decently educated. And that is why we need a lot of vocational education, a lot of education, people who are educated till class 12, 8, 9, and who can work in industries. So that amount of vocational education is not there in the country, and that's why we have that missing phase. Or one of the reasons is that why we have this missing phase of education, of the industrialization. And uh, then we have this last thing of healthcare. If we talk about healthcare, this is again from the National Family Health Survey, the recent one, the National Family Health Survey 5. And this basically shows that and the axes are reversed basically. What this shows, if you see the stunting, if it's on the LHS, so if it's increasing the amount of stunting, if you see the stunting amount, it was around 40%, and it had reduced to it from 44-45%. It had reduced to 39%, and now if you see, there is a small decline here. This decline basically means that it is the stunting is actually increasing. Now stunting is basically when you have a lower height for your age, and that shows the amount of malnutrition that you have in the country. Similarly, if you see anemia, now, if you see from 70% in 1998, you reduce the anemia level to 60%. And now, if you see, it is again going down to around 70%. So, the number of anemic kids, children with iron deficiency, it has again started to increase. Remember, the scales are inverted here on the left hand side axis. So, and if you see diarrhea, again, you see the in case of diarrhea and acute respiratory infection, all these two also, what the National Family Health Survey talks about is that in terms of anthropometric data, our numbers are falling. And in fact, if you talk about in general, India holds this dubious record of world's largest number of malnutrition kids. It's more than the sub-Saharan Africa. And that shows you that again, the outcomes have clearly not translated into health outcomes, anthropometric data. And that is something that the government needs to tackle clearly on. Then finally, coming to the fact of, just a second, folks. Yeah, coming to the fact that why this government is then so popular. If that's the case, then why is the government so popular? It's because of the fact that it has been able to build certain physical, digital, and social infrastructure. So you have this PM Gati Shakti, because of which you have been able to build a lot of roads and railways. If you talk about the digital transformation that this government has been able to do through financial inclusion, through UPI, that has led to a lot of poverty reduction. If you talk about this Niti Aayog report of poverty reduction, it gives a huge weightage to number of bank accounts that people have had, and that's why you see this fall in poverty according to Niti Aayog, because it includes bank accounts into its framework. And again, you have this transformation. Then again, in terms of essential goods, the government has been able to provide a number of essential goods in terms of Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, or Saubhagya Yojana, or Swachh Bharat Mission, or Jan Dhan accounts. So all of these are providing tap water to Har Ghar Nal Yojana. So all of this, what it has happened is that at the very basic level, the social infrastructure goods have been provided, and because of this, the government has become extremely popular among the masses. And this is one part of this governance that they have taken care of. But the other aspects of growth, which we need to identify, which we need to take care of, are ones that we had talked about: ones of education, one of skill development, other of your healthcare, in terms of basic commodities. These are the things that the government should probably take care of if you really want to increase the bottom line. Now, that this is what I had in store, folks. Just a second. Again, this slide is not working, I guess. I hope this works. Yeah, just a second. Hmm, why is this not working? Give me a second, folks. Yes, this is how it was supposed to work. So I would like to thank everyone for listening to me. Yeah, this is how it was supposed to end. And I would, these are my, just a second. Yeah, these are my credentials if you want to ever reach out to me. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take questions, folks.
Thank you, sir. It was an enlightening session. So now we move on to the question answer session.
Yes.
The first question is given by Shrestha Chaudhuri. How does the base affect inflation of the economy?
How does the base affect
Inflation of the economy.
inflation? Indication.
Yes, sir.
So see, let's understand the base effect, folks. So suppose I go to an exam. All right, and let's talk about my past. That I went to an exam and I scored, say, 20 marks on 100 in that exam. Now I went to my parents and I told them I've scored 20%. I failed the exam. I would receive a beating for sure. Now, suppose I'm a statistician now, and the next exam I score 30 marks out of 100. Now, how do I basically, I've again failed the exam because the minimum marks is basically is 40. Now, I failed the exam, but what can I do to avoid a beating? Now, as a statistician, what I will say is that I will go to my parents and I will say that I've increased my percentage. I've had a 50% increase in my percentage. Now, to a layman, it will say that okay, 50% increase sounds like a good increase, but from 20 marks you just increased to 30 marks, and that 10 marks over 20 marks is the base effect. That because you had a lower base, 10 marks over 20 marks, you were able to increase by 50%. But think of someone at say 80 marks. For that particular person, a 20 mark jump means 16 marks. So to move from 80 to 96 is very difficult, but to move from 20 to 30 is very easy. So when you have a lower base, you can easily clock in a higher growth rate. But when you have a higher growth rate, it is very difficult to surpass that. It is very difficult to grow on that. So that is basically called as base effect. At a lower base, you can easily grow at a faster pace. But when you are already growing fast, to top it all will be really difficult. And that is why you also see advanced countries have a very huge base of growth rate, and that's why they, even if they grow by say 2%, 1%, for what does US target? US targets a 2% growth rate, and but the base is huge. 2% of such a huge economy is huge. Whereas India is a smaller economy, it can expect to grow at say 7%. So this is what is called as base effect. I hope I was clear.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The next question we have is from Shubhayon. We
Okay.
know that India's GDP started declining pre-pandemic. However, by the time pandemic has already made a serious impact on the Western GDPs. Is this Western influence reason for the decline in Indian GDP pre-pandemic?
No, typically pre-pandemic is because of our own deeds. We had something called as four balance sheet issues. So even before the pandemic, if you see actually you need to see the growth rate in early 2010s. Now in early 2010s, we had a problem called as twin balance sheet problem. Now, when I told you this financial architecture, I told you that there's an important piece in this financial architecture called financial intermediaries, whose work is to give funds to the investors and the borrowers. Remember that linkage that I told you. Now, what had happened in the early 2010 to 2014 was that the banks had stopped giving money to the corporates and to the borrowers. Why they had stopped? Because of the fact that there were too many NPAs in the banking sector. There were too many non-performing assets. People had taken loans and had not given banks money back, and there was courts, there was CVC, there was CBI behind all these bankers, which were basically scrutinizing every action of the bankers, that why you have given a particular entity a loan. So we call this as four C's: problem of courts, problem of CBI, problems of your CVC, and problems of CAG. So these were the four C's which were behind all these banking institutions, because of which these banking institutions had stopped lending to corporate sector. Now, this was called as the twin balance sheet problem, because one, the balance sheet of the banks were problematic because they had a lot of NPA, non-performing assets, on their banking accounts. The other issue was that the corporates were not able to take loans because of the fact that their own balance sheets were problematic. But then what did the corporate sector do? What the people who wanted money, what did they do? They started tapping the non-banking financial sector, the ILFS, the Diwan Housing Corporation. So these are non-banking financial institutions which did not have the same regulations as the banking sector, and that's why we used to call them as shadow banking. They did not have the stringent banking regulations which normal scheduled commercial banks had. Now, this non-banking sector had started giving money to these borrowers, especially the real estate sector. And what we saw in 2018, 17, 18, 19 was that the real estate sector started going down. And because of that, the loans that these non-banking financial institutions had given to these borrowers had started defaulting. And that's why you had this entire hemorrhage, or you had this entire clog or kind of a I mean, thinning of the arteries of the Indian financial sector, where funds were not being circulated. The banks had stopped giving money. Now the NBFCs had also stopped giving money. So the entire blood circulation, so as to say, of finance had stopped, and that led to that particular crisis before the pandemic. So it has more to do with the with an internal setting of the country, rather than the external setting in the world. Yes, the external setting was not very conducive because of the trade wars and the kind of policies that Trump was following. But at the same point of time, it had to do more domestically than internationally. Yes. Next question, please.
Yes, the next question is from Shornali Dotto. If employment rate is decreasing, then how come the service sector is facing such a massive boom? Also, the business laws of India are not supportive for foreign business owners, which cause exit of company like Ford, which too decreases the employment. So, will a change in laws increase the employment rate?
So yes and no, both. I would say what we are doing right now is that we have this scheme called as the PLI scheme, Production Linked Incentive Scheme. Now, see, really cannot, we really, if a company is closing down and shutting off its business in India, it's not just because of the fact that India, I mean, Indian laws are bad, but also India is a difficult market. At the same point of time, if you see Hyundai has done extremely well. How has Kia done extremely well? Why did Ford not do well? It was not able to reach to the masses. Indian household work in a typical way, which Sandro was able to imagine our mindset. Indian typical middle class thinks in a particular way. So you need to have this customization. Let's think about McDonald's. McDonald's is extremely popular in India, but you don't have these beef burgers being offered in India. They have aloo tikki burger, they have these cheeseburgers, they have these Indianized versions of its burgers. So when you are selling in India, you need to have your Indianized versions, and that is how you capture the attention of India's market. So Ford is an exception, and India is also the graveyard for a lot of automobiles industry. You see GM, you see Daewoo. There are a number of companies which have come in India and failed, but you have a number of companies like Morris Garages, who's done extremely well now. So Indian markets and industries is very peculiar in certain sense, and you need to understand the Indian market. But yes, India is trying to change its laws as well now, and it is working as well. So if you see, there's the scheme called PLI, production linked incentive schemes. Now, because of this PLI scheme, India has now become world's largest exporter of mobile phones. And now we have forced these companies in India to that you will not be able to import laptops in the country. See, a lot of majority of our laptops in the country were being imported from China. Now, because of the geopolitical tensions that we've had, we wanted to stop this, but the companies were not buying, were not willing to invest in the Indian manufacturing setup to manufacture laptops. So what we did in early part of September was we asked these companies that you will not be able to import laptops in the country without a license. Now this basically released the cat among pigeons, and all these companies now started winding up and said that no, we will participate in the PLI scheme, and we'll take your incentives and we'll start manufacturing in the country. And that is what has happened. That now all these manufacturers, except for Apple, has said that we'll manufacture our laptops in the country. And at times you need to force your hand, and that is also the case of other companies as well. We are a huge market for Twitter. We are a huge market for WhatsApp, for Meta. You have to follow our rules, and we have alternatives available with us. But at the same point of time, to draw that point, that we need to be I would say a fair umpire. That is something that is not there in our country. We at times are unfair. The regulating bodies are unfair towards certain domestic players as compared to Amazon, as compared to foreign players. See the kind of stepmotherly treatment that has been given to say Amazon and Walmart as compared to Reliance Retail. So that shows you some kind of biasness that we have had in terms of our regulators. So that basically discourages certain kind of investors. Of course, a lot can be done, a lot should be done, because just like case of, say, you want to make electronics a major hub in the country, but for electronics you need these chips called semiconductor chips. But for semiconductor chips, you need absolutely clean surfaces, clean environment. You also need 100% assured electricity. You need 100% pure water. You need very skilled labor. Until unless you have all these elements together, how will you manufacture these micro or these semiconductor chips? So all these things needs to be worked on if you really want to produce. Each particular industry would have its own typical nuances. You need to think about those nuances, and then work towards that. But it's at least we have realized this and we are working towards it. But again, it will take maybe another 5-10 years to see the fruits of PLI really realize in terms of our manufacturing robustness. Yes. One final question, please, folks, if there is any.
Okay, so yeah, we have one more question. This is from Koshik De.
Yes.
India is an agro-based economy with huge cultivative lands, but the agricultural sector has not witnessed any growth, nor has the issues of farmers made headlines.
Hmm.
So, what should be the first step to improve our agricultural sector?
So clearly, this is a dilemma. This is a conundrum for India. See, you can't have 42 in a modern state society. You can't have 45% of your workforce in the agrarian sector. That's clearly not the case in a 21st century. So one thing is we need to move people out of agriculture, but the other thing is that we need to make agriculture more productive. One thing that we were planning to do in 2020 was these farm laws. We were trying to introduce the private sector to the farming arena, and that is something that we need to do. We right now we have a disaggregated level of farming sector. We have very small farmers working very individualistically. What we need is the corporate sector. What we need is farmer producer organizations, professional farmer producer organizations to get into the agricultural domain, and then work through technology. Often in my class, I give this example. If you really want to see how agriculture is being done, there is this on Netflix. There is this documentary by the name of Business of Drugs. In Business of Drugs, you have this episode on cultivation of marijuana. Just look at the way that how marijuana is cultivated in US. The kind of professionalism now some states have legalized it. The kind of professionalism that they have in terms of cultivation. Now, what do you have is in a state like Texas, where you have nothing, you have absolutely nothing except for oil or say vast deserts. So what they have done is that on deserts they have built up huge warehouses, where in these warehouses you are using hydroponics to manufacture marijuana, and the best quality of marijuana in the world. Why can't you replicate that in our country? You really do not need, in the 21st century, you really do not need sun, you really do not need water. You need hydroponics, you need technology, you need sensors, you need UV lights to cultivate anything that you want. Technology can aid you. Instead of having one crop of wheat per year, you can have four crops of wheat per year. This is nature on steroids. So the future, as I see the future of agriculture, it has to be with technology, especially applications of AI and machine learning in the sphere of agriculture, and that cannot be done by individual farmers. You need entrepreneurs to get into that particular area, and that's why we need those agrarian reforms. But see, agriculture, constitutionally, agriculture is a state subject, so states needs to take this up. States need to promote these agrarian farmers, and we have already seen this revolution. See, I'm not sure whether it's there in West Bengal or not. You have this in the milk industry. You have a company called as Country Delight. At least in North India we have it, and it gives us the better quality of milk than Amul, better quality of ghee than Amul, and it's run by an IIT IIM grad. Similarly, you have multiple startups which are there in this particular domain. So you really want to unleash the dynamism of the private sector and the technological sector in agriculture in the coming future. If you want to increase the share of agriculture in the GDP, and if you want to reduce the number of people who are there right now working in agriculture to industrial sector and the services sector. So this is probably the way forward, but again, it will take maybe 20 years to realize this, and a lot of support from the individual states.
So actually, we have a few more questions. If you allow, then we'll just have
Actually,
two
I
more
have
questions.
I have another I have another session at 2, so I would like to give my throat a little bit of rest. What you can do is, I have already provided. I think I provided my number here, so you can ping me on my number. I'll put this lecture on my YouTube as well. This is my Instagram channel as well, so you can post on any which ways, but you need to be very patient with replies. At times it takes me a day or two, maybe 3 days to basically Sundays on the weekends are the times when I actually see my WhatsApp and try to see who all I have to reply to. So be patient. If you have questions, you can reach out there. You can add comments on the YouTube lecture. I'll post it there, and then maybe me or someone else from the community will probably reply to that. So this is, I would say, this is about it from my side, folks. Apologies, I need to rush as well. So I would like to thank you all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So we have reached.
Last minute. Sir, I was going to say, can you please share the PPT in WhatsApp to Tanisha so that we can circulate it to the registered mail IDs? It will
I
be
will
very
do that. I will do that. I will do
Thank
that.
you, sir.
So we have reached the end of the meeting. Siddharth sir, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Your expertise really helped to understand the hidden challenges and complexities of such a crucial topic so beautifully. We hope you had a good time sharing your valuable knowledge and insights with us. And thank you to each and everyone present here for tuning in, for sending through your questions, which made it even more interesting. And I'm sure you found the entire discussion as thought provoking as I did. So, yes, that is it. We shall end it here. Once again, thank you and have a great day, everyone.
So
Thank
one
you.
more thing which I would like to add, if everybody could just switch on their video cameras, and so if you could also switch on your camera once for a quick screenshot, uh, because we had a very good webinar, so we would like to keep a memory of it.
Um, just a second. Give me 1 second. Uh, yes, I hope my camera is there.
No, sir, actually.
Just
Yes.
yeah, okay. I think it's
Yes, sir.
there.
Now it's visible.
Yes.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Thank you, folks. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.